If someone had told me a year ago that the man across the courtyard, the one who hammered and sawed and shouted at his friends on the phone, would become the axis my entire world tilted on, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the dry, brittle sound I reserved for things that were fundamentally impossible, like spontaneous human combustion or winning the lottery. My life was a meticulously curated collection of quiet routines, a fortress built of solitude and silence. Love wasn't on the map. Connection was a foreign country I had no visa for. My apartment was my sanctuary. 2 rooms, minimalist and clean, with a large picture window that overlooked the shared green space of our building complex. It was my observation deck. From there, I watched the world, and more specifically, I watched him. His name was Julian. I learned it from a package left by his door one afternoon. Julian Vance. The name felt solid, like him. He was a contractor, I guessed, from the logos on his perpetually dusty truck and the way he moved with a physical certainty that I, a man who made his living moving pixels on a screen, could only marvel at. He was a creature of the sun. In the summer, he worked with his shirt off in the courtyard, muscles in his back and shoulders shifting under tan skin as he measured lengths of wood. He was loud. His laughter was a booming, unself-conscious thing that echoed off the brick walls. His phone conversations were public performances, full of easy profanity and jokes I couldn't hear but could imagine from the relaxed confidence in his posture. He was, in every conceivable way, my opposite. My existence was internal, a quiet hum of anxieties and observations. His was external, a vibrant, noisy declaration of presence. He was a bonfire, I was the faint glow of a laptop screen in a dark room. And so I watched. It became a part of my routine, as ingrained as grinding my coffee beans every morning or backing up my files every night. I'd sit at my desk, feigning work, and my eyes would drift across the green lawn to his window, to his patch of patio, to the space he occupied in the world. He was a puzzle of broad shoulders and calloused hands, of easy smiles and a furrowed brow when he was concentrating on a blueprint. We had a system, though he was an unwitting participant. We'd pass in the hallway, a shared corridor of beige walls and scuffed flooring. I'd feel his approach like a change in atmospheric pressure. He was just so large. So present. My instinct was to shrink, to make myself smaller, to press myself against the wall and let him pass. He'd give a short, sharp nod, his eyes barely registering me. I'd return it with a jerky motion of my own, my heart thumping a stupid, frantic rhythm against my ribs. That was the extent of our interaction for the first 11 months. A nod. A shared space of 10 feet for 5 seconds. It was a perfectly defined distance, a chasm I had no intention of ever crossing. He was a landscape I enjoyed from afar, a piece of art I could appreciate without ever needing to touch. Touching it would ruin it. Touching it would ruin me. My carefully constructed piece was fragile. A man like him, a force of nature like him, would shatter it without even noticing. So I kept my distance. I catalogued the details of his life from my window. The woman with the blonde hair who stayed for 2 weeks and then disappeared. The old, scruffy dog he sometimes watched for a friend, throwing a tennis ball for it in the courtyard with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. The way he'd sit on his patio steps after a long day, a beer in one hand, and just stare up at the sky, his face uncharacteristically still and thoughtful. In my head, he was a character in a story I was writing, a story no one would ever read. He was the confident, capable hero. I was the narrator, unseen and unheard. It was safe. It was manageable. And then the storm came. It wasn't just a storm, it was a meteorological event. The sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow in the middle of the afternoon. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that made the glass in my window pane vibrate. I loved storms, usually. They were an excuse to retreat further into my shell, to make a pot of tea and feel cozy while the world raged outside. They reinforced the safety of my walls. But this was different. The rain came down not in sheets, but in solid, angry waves that battered the building. The lights flickered once, twice, and then, with a collective groan from every appliance in my apartment, they died. Darkness. And a sudden, profound silence, broken only by the shrieking of the wind. My first reaction was annoyance. I had a deadline. My second, a low thrum of anxiety. I checked my phone. No service. The cell towers were probably down. The building's emergency lights in the hallway cast a weak, alien green glow under my door. I was an island. Hours passed. The storm didn't let up. The temperature in my apartment began to drop, the damp chill seeping through the window frames. I lit a few candles, the flickering light making the shadows in my familiar space dance and twist into unfamiliar shapes. My solitude, usually a comfort, began to feel like a cage. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was a physical weight pressing down on me. I found myself at the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. The courtyard was a mess of fallen leaves and broken branches. And then I saw it. A light. A single, steady, warm light from his window. Julian's window. He had a generator. Of course he did. He was the kind of man who was prepared for things, who could fix things, who could face down a storm and wrestle it into submission. I watched the golden rectangle of his window, a beacon in the churning dark. I could just make out his silhouette moving inside, calm and purposeful. My stomach twisted with a feeling I couldn't name. It was a bitter cocktail of envy and longing. He was over there, safe and warm. I was over here, cold and isolated. The distance between our windows had never felt so vast, so impassable. I turned away from the window, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. I would just wait it out. That's what I did. I waited for things to pass. It was my primary coping mechanism. Then came the knock. It was so loud in the oppressive silence that I physically flinched. 3 hard, solid raps on my door. No one ever knocked on my door. My heart, that frantic trapped bird, beat a panic tattoo against my ribs. My mind raced. Who could it possibly be? I crept to the door, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. I peered through the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. It was him. Julian. He was standing in the eerie green glow of the hallway, his hair damp, wearing a thick gray hoodie. His shoulders seemed to take up the entire frame. He looked uncertain. It was an expression I had never seen on his face before. He knocked again, a little softer this time. My hand trembled as I unlocked the door. I opened it just a crack, the security chain still in place. He looked down at me, and for the first time, his eyes didn't just slide past me. They focused. They were a startlingly clear shade of green, like sea glass. "Hey," he said. His voice was lower than I expected, a gravelly rumble that was nothing like the booming tone he used on the phone. "Power's out." A brilliant observation. I just stared at him, my throat suddenly full of sand. He seemed to take my silence for confusion. "I saw your place was dark. I've got a generator running. Got coffee on the stove, if you want. It's warmer than this hallway," he gestured vaguely with his head. My mind went completely blank. Every social script I'd ever learned evaporated. Julian. My neighbor. The man from the window. Was inviting me over. Into his apartment. The thought was so staggering, so far outside the realm of possibility, that I couldn't process it. "Oh," I managed to say. It was a pathetic little sound. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It wasn't the big, easy grin I saw from my window. It was small, hesitant. "Look, man, you look cold. Come on over." I'm not gonna bite. I should have said no. I should have thanked him and politely declined, retreating back into my cold, dark, safe fortress. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the me thing to do. But the word that came out of my mouth was, "Okay." I slid the chain off, opened the door, and followed him across the hall. The 5 steps from my door to his felt like crossing a continent. His apartment was a mirror image of mine in layout, but in every other way, it was a different world. Where mine was sparse and pale, his was full of warm woods and dark colors. A massive, comfortable-looking leather sofa dominated the living room. Shelves overflowed with books, not decorative hardbacks, but worn paperbacks with cracked spines. There was a faint smell of sawdust, coffee, and something else, something uniquely him. It was clean, but it was lived in. It was a home. A single lamp was on, plugged into an extension cord that snaked back towards the patio, where I could hear the low hum of the generator. The light cast a warm, intimate glow over everything. "Coffee?" he asked, already moving towards the small kitchen. "Yes. Please." I stood awkwardly in the entryway, feeling like an intruder, my blanket still clutched around me like a shield. He moved with an economy of motion that was captivating. He poured coffee from a stovetop percolator into 2 thick ceramic mugs, his large hand surprisingly steady. He didn't seem to have any of the social awkwardness that was currently paralyzing me. He was just doing. He handed me a mug. Our fingers brushed. It was nothing, a fleeting contact of skin on skin, but a jolt went through me, sharp and electric. I nearly dropped the mug. Heat flared in my cheeks. "Get a grip, Leo." "Thanks," I mumbled, wrapping my cold hands around the welcome warmth of the ceramic. He gestured to the sofa. "Have a seat." I sat on the very edge of the cushion, perching as if ready to flee at any moment. He took the armchair opposite me, sinking into it with a weary sigh that seemed to come from deep in his bones. Up close, he was different. The sheer, overwhelming physicality of him was the same, but the details were new. There was a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes, which I'd only ever seen from a distance, had tiny flecks of gold in them. And he looked tired. There were dark smudges under his eyes that his usual energy and vitality disguised. The bonfire was burning a little lower tonight. "Crazy storm," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Yeah," my voice was still tight. The silence that followed wasn't entirely uncomfortable. It was filled with the sound of the wind and the rain, and the steady hum of the generator. It felt contained. We were in a bubble, a small pocket of light and warmth carved out of the storm. "I'm Julian, by the way," he said, looking at me over the rim of his mug. "Leo." "Leo," he repeated my name slowly, as if testing the shape of it in his mouth. "I've seen you around." My stomach did a nervous little flip. He's seen me. He's noticed me. Of course he had. We lived 10 feet apart. But it felt like a confession. "You're a writer or something, right?" he asked. "You're always at that desk." The question was so direct, so observational, it caught me off guard. He hadn't just seen me. He had been watching me. The realization sent another jolt through my system, this one less panic and more, something else. Something warm and unsettling. "Graphic designer," I corrected him, my voice barely a whisper. "I work from home." "Huh?" he nodded, a genuine interest in his eyes. "That's cool. Must be nice, not having to deal with a commute. It has its perks, like being able to watch your neighbor from your window without anyone knowing." The thought made my cheeks burn again. I took a large gulp of coffee. It was strong and black and perfect. We fell silent again. I risked a glance around his living room. A framed photo on the bookshelf caught my eye. It was of Julian and an older man, both of them grinning, holding up a ridiculously large fish. They had the same eyes. "My dad," Julian said, following my gaze. "Fishing trip up at Lake Huron a few years back. Before he got sick." The casual slide into vulnerability was unexpected. The Julian from my window didn't talk about sick fathers. He laughed and hammered things and existed in a state of perpetual, uncomplicated strength. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling inadequate. He just shrugged, but his eyes were fixed on the photo. "It is what it is." He taught me how to build things. How to fix things. Taught me to always have a generator. For nights like this, he gave a small, sad smile. The power dynamic, the one that had existed purely in my head for almost a year, was shifting. He wasn't just the strong, silent monolith I had built him up to be. He was a person. A son who missed his father. A man who looked tired. This realization didn't make him smaller, it made him more. More real. More complex. And infinitely more dangerous to the careful equilibrium of my life. I found myself relaxing, just a fraction. I leaned back into the soft leather of the sofa, the blanket pooling around my waist. My dad taught me how to alphabetize a bookshelf, the words were out before I could stop them. A pathetic attempt at a shared experience. To my surprise, Julian laughed. A real laugh, not the booming one from the courtyard, but a quieter, warmer sound that filled the small space. "Hey, That's a useful skill. Look at this mess, he gestured to his own chaotic shelves. I smiled. A real smile. It felt foreign on my face. We talked for hours. Or maybe it was only 1 hour. Time seemed to warp in the candlelight, in the insulated world of his apartment. We didn't talk about anything profound. We talked about his work, the frustrations of dealing with city inspectors. I talked about my work, the absurdity of clients asking for a logo that was both minimalist and ornate. We talked about bad movies and good books and the best place to get pizza in the neighborhood. It was the easiest conversation I'd had in years. There was no pretense. He was direct and curious, and he listened in a way that made me feel seen. Actually seen. Not just observed through a window, but understood. At some point, he got up to put another log in the small, cast-iron stove in the corner I hadn't even noticed. The building had sealed most of the fireplaces, but of course he had found a way to make his functional. He knelt before it, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the strong lines of his back. I watched the play of muscle under his hoodie, the way the orange light caught in his hair. He turned back and sat on the floor, his back against the armchair, closer to the warmth of the fire. And closer to me. Our knees were only inches apart. I could feel the heat radiating off him, a tangible presence. My own body felt hyper-aware, every nerve ending tingling. It's probably going to be out all night, he said, his voice low and rumbling. The radio said a transformer blew a few blocks away. Oh, the thought of returning to my cold, dark apartment was suddenly unbearable. The solitude I had once craved now seemed like a punishment. He looked at me, his green eyes serious in the firelight. You can stay here. On the sofa. It's no problem. My heart did a slow, painful somersault. Stay here. The words hung in the air between us, charged with a significance that went far beyond simple hospitality. I don't want to impose, I said, the automatic, polite refusal springing to my lips. It's not imposing, Leo, he said my name again, and the sound of it in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. It's a storm. People are supposed to help each other out. He held my gaze, and in that moment, the air thickened. The space between us became a live wire. The rest of the world, the storm, the power outage, it all faded away until there was only the flickering firelight, the sound of the rain, and the intense focus of his eyes on mine. This was it. A precipice. I could retreat, thank him, and go back to my side of the courtyard, preserving the safe distance I had always maintained. Or I could stay. I could take a step off the edge and see what it felt like to fall. I took a breath. Okay, I said. Thank you. He gave me a slow nod, a flicker of relief in his eyes. He got up and pulled a heavy quilt and a pillow from a closet. He arranged them on the sofa, his movements efficient and oddly gentle. Bathroom's there. Let me know if you need anything, he gestured, then hesitated for a moment before heading towards his bedroom. He stopped at the door. Good night, Leo. Good night, Julian. I lay down on the sofa, pulling the quilt up to my chin. It smelled like him. That faint scent of sawdust and fresh air and something else I couldn't place. It was comforting and terrifying all at once. I was sleeping in his living room. I was inside the frame of the window I had spent so much time looking into. I didn't sleep for a long time. I listened to the sounds of the storm and the faint sounds of him moving around in his room. I was acutely aware of his presence, just a thin wall away. My mind was a whirlwind of everything we had talked about, of the way he looked in the firelight, of the accidental brush of our fingers. I must have drifted off eventually, because I was woken by a change in the silence. The rain had softened to a gentle patter. I opened my eyes. Julian was standing by the fireplace, his back to me, adding another log to the dying embers. He was wearing only a pair of gray sweatpants, riding low on his hips. My breath caught. In the dim glow of the fire, his back was a landscape of muscle and shadow. A long, thin scar ran vertically next to his spine, a pale line against his tanned skin. I had a sudden, insane urge to trace it with my finger. He must have sensed I was awake, because he turned his head and looked at me over his shoulder. His expression was unreadable. Sorry, he murmured. Didn't mean to wake you. It's okay, my voice was thick with sleep. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. The air was still and heavy with unspoken things. The careful, friendly neutrality of our earlier conversation was gone, replaced by a raw, palpable tension. My heart was hammering. This is it. This is the moment I run. This is the moment I pretend to be asleep. But I didn't. I just looked back at him, my own fear and longing a tangled knot in my chest. He moved slowly, closing the distance between us. He knelt down beside the sofa. We were at eye level. His face was only a foot from mine. I could see the stubble on his jaw, the way the firelight made his eyes glow. "Leo," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "I have to. I'm not good at this." He faltered, searching for words. I saw a flicker of the same vulnerability I'd seen earlier, but magnified. The strong, confident Julian was gone. In his place was someone uncertain. Someone afraid. And in his fear, I found a strange, unexpected surge of courage. "It's okay," I whispered back. He let out a shaky breath. "I see you. At your window. Sometimes I feel like you're the only person who actually sees me at all." The confession hit me like a physical blow. It was the last thing I ever expected to hear. He wasn't just the object of my observation, I was the object of his. We had been watching each other, two lonely men in our separate towers, looking across a courtyard that might as well have been an ocean. "I thought I was imagining it," he continued, his voice barely audible. "That I was just lonely. Making things up. But tonight, talking to you." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He raised a hand, his calloused, capable fingers hesitating in the air for a moment before they gently touched my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, a touch so feather-light and tender it made my eyes burn. It was a question. And I answered it by leaning into his touch, closing the final inch between us. His kiss was not what I expected. I had imagined, in my foolish, secret daydreams, something forceful and demanding, like the rest of him. But it was slow. It was hesitant. His lips were soft, questioning. It was a kiss that asked for permission, that waited for a response. I gave it, my own fears melting away in the face of this staggering, impossible reality. I kissed him back, a silent confession of all the months of watching, of all the unspoken longing. It wasn't about passion, not yet. It was about recognition. It was two solitudes, finally touching. He made a soft sound in the back of his throat and deepened the kiss, his other hand coming up to cradle the back of my head. It was still gentle, but now there was a certainty to it, a relief. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His thumb continued its slow, hypnotic path along my jaw. "Leo," he breathed, the name a prayer. I didn't know what to say. The world had been turned on its head. Everything I thought I knew, about him, about myself, had been rewritten in the last few hours. He pulled back slightly, his green eyes searching mine in the dim light. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a question this time. It was a plea. Don't go back to your apartment." He meant in his bed. The unspoken invitation hung between us, terrifying and beautiful. I gave a single, shaky nod. He stood up, his hand finding mine, and pulled me gently to my feet. He led me to his bedroom without a word. The room was dark, the only light spilling in from the fire in the other room. He didn't let go of my hand as he pulled back the covers. We slipped into the bed, the sheets cool against my skin. He turned to face me, and in the darkness, he pulled me against his chest. I could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart against my ear. His arms wrapped around me, holding me with a possessive strength that felt less like a cage and more like an anchor. I had never felt so safe in my entire life. I fell asleep like that, wrapped in his arms, the smell of wood smoke and Julian filling my senses. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel alone. I woke to a jarring, unfamiliar hum. The refrigerator. The clock on the bedside table was blinking 12:00. The power was back on. The room was filled with the flat, gray light of early morning. The magic of the firelit darkness was gone, replaced by the stark reality of day. I was alone in the bed. A cold knot of panic tightened in my stomach. I sat up. The quilt from the sofa was neatly folded at the foot of the bed. Julian's scent lingered on the pillow, but he was gone. I could hear noises from the kitchen. The clink of a coffee mug. The sound of a cabinet closing. My anxiety, a familiar and unwelcome companion, came rushing back in. The night felt like a dream. A strange, impossible fantasy brought on by the storm. In the harsh light of day, it couldn't possibly be real. He regretted it. Of course he regretted it. I was a moment of storm-induced madness, a curiosity. My clothes were on the floor where I'd left them. I dressed with fumbling, clumsy fingers, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to get out of there. I had to get back to my own apartment, back to my own life, before he had to suffer the awkwardness of kicking me out. I crept out of the bedroom, my shoes in my hand. He was in the kitchen, his back to me, pouring coffee. He was fully dressed in his work clothes, jeans and a thick flannel shirt. Ready to go. Ready to get back to his normal life. A life that didn't include me. He heard me, and turned. His face was a closed, unreadable mask. The warmth from last night was gone. The vulnerability was gone. He looked like the men from across the courtyard again. Distant. Unapproachable. "Hey," he said. His voice was flat. "Power's back." I see that. I couldn't meet his eyes. I focused on a spot on the wall behind his head. I should go. "Thanks for everything." The words felt hollow and stupid. He just nodded, his jaw tight. He didn't say, "Stay for coffee." He didn't say, "Don't go." He didn't say anything. He just watched me as I pulled on my shoes and scurried to the door. "Leo." I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, my back still to him. I braced myself for the rejection. Last night was a mistake. I'll see you around. It was worse than a rejection. It was a dismissal. A return to the status quo. To nods in the hallway. My chest ached with a sudden, sharp pain. "Yeah," I whispered, and fled. Back in my own apartment, the silence was deafening. It was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. The air was thick with his absence. I stood in the middle of my living room, my body still humming with the memory of his touch, the scent of him still clinging to my clothes. I felt like a fool. A complete and utter idiot. I had broken my own cardinal rule. I had let someone in. I had stepped off the precipice, and instead of flying, I had crashed. I went to the window, the scene of my long, silent obsession. His truck was gone. He had gone to work. The world had reset itself. The storm was over. The next 2 days were a special kind of hell. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. I just stared at the screen, the cursor blinking on an empty page. Every creak in the hallway made me jump. Every time I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, I thought it was him. My apartment, my sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The solitude I had so carefully cultivated was now just loneliness, sharp and raw. Before, I had been watching a life I wasn't part of. Now, I had tasted it, and the return to my own was unbearable. I was haunted by the ghost of a possibility. I avoided the window. I couldn't bear to look at his apartment, to see the lights on and know I wasn't welcome there. I saw him once, getting out of his truck at the end of the day. He glanced up towards my window, his expression unreadable from this distance, and then quickly looked away. He didn't wave. He didn't even nod. He just disappeared inside his building. The silence stretched, thin and agonizing. My mind replayed every moment of that night, searching for clues I might have missed. The confession. The kiss. The way he held me. Had I imagined the tenderness? Had I projected my own longing onto him and seen what I wanted to see? The self-recrimination was relentless. I was too quiet. Too awkward. I wasn't like the people he usually had around, the loud, laughing friends, the pretty blonde woman. I was a creature from a different world, and for one night, the storm had allowed those worlds to overlap. Now, the natural order had been restored. On the third day, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I would go back to my routine. I would force myself to work. I would excise him from my thoughts. I would rebuild my fortress, stronger this time. I would forget the feel of his hand on my cheek, the sound of his heart beating against my ear. I was sitting at my desk, forcing myself to sketch out a logo concept, when the knock came. 3 hard, solid raps. The same as before. My blood ran cold. My breath hitched. It couldn't be. I was frozen in my chair, unable to move. Maybe if I stayed silent, he would go away. He knocked again, louder this time. Leo. I know you're in there. I can see your light. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. Slowly, as if moving through water, I stood up and walked to the door. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely work the lock. I opened it. He was standing there, looking exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes were more pronounced. He was holding 2 takeout containers that were filling the hallway with the smell of Thai food. He looked at me, and all the distance, all the masks from that horrible morning, were gone. His eyes were wide with a desperate, pleading vulnerability. I'm an idiot, he said, the words a raw confession. I am a complete, world-class idiot. Can I come in? I was speechless. I just stepped back and let him pass. He walked into my apartment, into my space, for the very first time. He looked around, his eyes taking in my clean, sparse world. He seemed to fill the room, his presence a vibrant, disruptive force. He set the food down on my small kitchen counter. He turned to face me, his hands shoved into his pockets. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I panicked, he said, his voice low and strained. That morning. When the power came back on. It was all real. And it scared the hell out of me. He finally looked up, and his eyes were shining with unshed tears. I'm not. I don't do that, Leo. I don't feel things like that. Or I haven't, in a very long time. I build things. I fix things. I don't know how to handle this. He made a vague gesture between the two of us. I thought you regretted it, I whispered, the words aching in my throat. No, the word was forceful, immediate. He took a step closer. God, no. Regret was the last thing I felt. I felt terrified. That it was too good. That I would screw it up. So I did what I always do. I ran. I put my walls back up. He let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh. Pretty stupid for a guy who tears down walls for a living. He was only a foot away now. These last 2 days, he said, his voice dropping even lower. They've been hell. Every time I looked at your dark window, I felt like I was suffocating. The silence was, it was worse than any storm. He had felt it too. The silence. The absence. I wasn't the only one. The relief that washed over me was so profound it made me dizzy. I'm not good with words, he said, shaking his head. I'm not like you. But I don't want to go back to just nodding in the hallway, Leo. I can't. He reached out, not to touch my face this time, but just to take my hand. His fingers wrapped around mine, his calloused palm warm and solid against my own. It was an anchor in the storm of my emotions. I was lonely, he admitted, his voice thick. I think I have been for a long time. I just didn't realize it until I wasn't. That night, with you. All my fear, all my anxiety, all the walls I had so painstakingly built around my heart, they just crumbled. They turned to dust in the face of his raw, clumsy, beautiful honesty. Me too, I said, my voice breaking. He pulled me forward, and his arms went around me, holding me tight. I buried my face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. It felt like coming home. I'm sorry I was an idiot, he mumbled into my hair. I'm sorry I ran, I countered. We stood there for a long time, just holding each other in the middle of my quiet apartment. It was a truce. An apology. A promise. Finally, he pulled back, though he kept his hands on my arms, as if afraid I might disappear. A small, real smile touched his lips. I brought you food. I figured you probably hadn't eaten. I hadn't. Not really. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single key on a plain silver ring. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "It's my spare," he said, his gaze steady and serious. "In case the power goes out again. Or in case it doesn't. In case you just want to come over." The weight of the key in my hand was immense. It was more than a piece of metal. It was a key to his home. To his life. It was an invitation without an expiration date. An act of trust. A tangible symbol of commitment. My throat was too tight to speak. I just nodded, clutching the key like it was the most precious thing I had ever owned. "Good," he said, a look of profound relief on his face. "Now, are you going to let me eat this pad thai before it gets cold?" And just like that, the tension broke. I laughed, a real, unburdened sound. We ate sitting on my floor, because I only owned one chair for my dining table. We talked and we laughed, and the distance between us, the chasm of the courtyard, vanished. It was no longer a barrier. It was just the space between our homes. That night, I used his key. I let myself into his apartment while he was in the shower. I waited for him in his bed, the sheets already holding our combined warmth. When he came out, a towel slung low on his hips, he stopped in the doorway and just looked at me. The smile that spread across his face was slow and radiant, and it was just for me. The weeks that followed were a quiet revelation. We found a rhythm. Some nights at my place, some at his. We learned the small, domestic intimacies of another person. He learned that I couldn't sleep without a fan on for white noise. I learned that he hummed, slightly off-key, when he made coffee in the morning. My apartment, once my fortress of solitude, started to change. One of his hoodies was permanently draped over my desk chair. A pair of his work boots sat by my door. His world was bleeding into mine, filling the empty spaces I hadn't even known were there. One Saturday morning, I woke up in his bed, the sun streaming through the window. He was still asleep, his arm thrown possessively over my waist, his breath warm on the back of my neck. I lay there, perfectly still, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams. I thought about the men I was a few months ago. The men who watched from his window, who lived a life of quiet observation, too afraid to participate. He wouldn't recognize this life. He wouldn't understand this feeling of profound, terrifying, wonderful peace. Julian was a disruption. He was a storm that had torn through the quiet landscape of my life, knocking down all my fences, rearranging all my careful plans. He had taken my solitude and shown me what it really was, loneliness. And then he had taken my hand and led me out of it. He stirred behind me, his arm tightening around me. He pressed a sleepy kiss to my shoulder. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I whispered back, turning in his arms to face him. He looked at me, his green eyes soft and clear in the morning light. There were no walls between us anymore. No masks. There was just this. Just us. My life was once a story I was writing in my head, a story where I was only the narrator. But Julian had pulled me onto the page. He had given me a voice, a role, a hand to hold. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the one that changed everything. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out how it ended. I was just happy to be living it.